Välkommen till Stolpe Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från Bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet heter Svante Tirén.
Wars, revolutions and pandemics are recurring phenomena in human history. In the book Society in Crisis, 25 world-leading scholars describe and analyze how different societies have handled these situations and highlight humanity's unprecedented capacity for adaptation and reorientation. A crisis entails problems, but also opportunities. In today's episode, we interview Alastair Benn, Deputy Editor of Engelskberg Ideas. He joins us via link from London to talk about how we can learn from this history. So first of all, very welcome to the podcast, Alastair.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, if we start with the pandemic, are there any signs that this globally shared crisis changed our interest in history? And if so, how?
Well, many of us were seeking models for what was going on at the time as events unfolded. For example, sales of Albert Camus' The Plague went through the roof. And Albert Camus, in this novel, was himself attempting to use disease as a kind of crucible in which to kind of structure his own experience of the Second World War, the French experience of the Second World War, the fall in 1940, shock of occupation, and Vichy. So disease helped Camus think about contemporary events, which was then to become the stuff of history. And for many of us, searching, especially in that first lockdown period, we were searching for ways to contain the complexity of what was going on. And disease can actually offer some really attractive analogies and metaphors, something that Camus clearly latched onto. We've all been ill. We all know intuitively that when you're ill, you get a sense of getting more and more sickened. The fever reaches a crisis and then may or may not dissipate. It may go on. You may die.
So it's definitely a heightened sense of existential sort of awareness, let's say.
Exactly, of peril. And Lawrence Friedman, one of the contributors to the volume, contributed a really brilliant essay, actually kind of demystifying that idea on a historical level. So he said that this crisis may not proceed at all like an illness that we're all familiar with. It may proceed in further waves. It may behave in unpredictable ways. And I thought that essay, which was written in that first period when we didn't really know how things were going to proceed, has really stood up over time, and he can be really proud of it. And it's the best description I've read, certainly, of the history that we then lived through. And what Lawrence did in that essay was to use history to talk about crisis in a way that made us feel like the crisis we were living through, number one, was not unparalleled, and number two, was something that went beyond each of us as individuals and probably made us feel less lonely in that kind of experience. So I think history definitely helped us think about the crisis, and certainly our experience of crisis hopefully has made the study of history a bit more urgent for all of us.
It's an opportunity perhaps to connect more. I mean, events that seems very abstract, once you live through them yourself, suddenly you can see them from a new awareness.
Exactly, and it's that awareness which is best buttressed by history. You know, history is just one way to understand the past. You know, we have myth, we have story, poetry, drama, novels. We all know, for example, that learning about human situations from the best teachers when we read novels, Flaubert about aspects of relationships or Dickens about urban life or whatever, we all know there's a kind of endless choice there. We all know that makes you better adjusted. And I think history is at least as powerful a tool to do the same thing, but to think more about the structure of what's going on, about the kind of deep dynamics that are unfolding. And you know, I think we should put our faith in good history in times of crisis, of risk, of peril, because it's a very powerful tool.
Certainly. Now, this book is massive in a sense because it contains 25 different writers writing about very different topics. But on a more general level, why are historical crises particularly important to learn about? I mean, as you say, they are a tool, but are there other ways they can help us orient ourselves in our own time?
It's such a good question. I kind of like to approach it by thinking about how historians, at the moment anyway, are trying to do away with our traditional definitions of crisis. So the academic historian Adam Tooze, who is particularly famous for writing a global history of the financial crash called Crashed, has recently made very public arguments for a term called polycrisis. So he says we live in an era of polycrisis. His argument is essentially that we need like a new special word, to describe the peculiarity and newness of our situation. So he argues that at no other point have so many disparate crises come together. And, I am sympathetic. It does feel at the moment like events mount up at a prodigious rate. We really do live in an age that has a momentum like quite unlike those that went before. And I guess Tooze picks out the climate crisis, for example, as something that applies particularly to this problem. It does feel like a genuinely formidable challenge in the face of which like even the kind of muse of history can't give us wisdom and guidance. And, I'm sympathetic to that. But academic historians are always trying to coin a phrase, Eric Hobsbawm's long 19th century, Fukuyama's end of history, etc. They all want to be on academic syllabuses in the future, and maybe polycrisis in 50 years' time will be on syllabus. It will be, undergraduates will have to respond. Was the era from 2000 to 2030 really an era of polycrisis, or what was really going on? But saying all that, I think, I'm kind of skeptical of this term sense of crises happening all at once, potentially as a feature of how information overloaded we are. Hopefully something this book does something to address. There's a lot of information in the book, but it's set out hopefully in a clear way that can help us make sense of specific situations. We all know switching on your mobile phone is to be kind of immersed in a stress-laden reality, and perspective, especially historical perspective, is the first casualty of tech-mediated experience. So why is it so important to retain an idea that like historical crises matter, and studying them is some aid to understanding the present? Well, again, I just come back to the idea that history is such a powerful tool. And I think it's demonstrated that history is such a powerful tool that when it's badly applied, it can lead to terrible events. If you apply history badly to the present, it can lead you down terrible paths. But that also opens you up to an alternative vision where applying history to the present makes you better adjusted, makes you more resilient, gives you better capacity to deal with the complexity of what's going on. We will all make mistakes, but I think we might as well make mistakes knowing what we're doing.
Right. Well-informed mistakes, let's say.
Yes, well-informed mistakes, yeah. If you look at the kind of broad sweep of history, especially modern history, it's not like our policymakers didn't make mistakes 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. But, for sure, a lot of them were much more engaged in the kind of public art of reading and understanding history than a lot of modern policymakers. And I'm sympathetic, the pressures on modern politicians, the way social media, 24-hour news, that militates against perspective. But I think still the best of them do rise to that challenge. And hopefully a book like this, it's, some of the essays are potentially a challenge, but it's really pitched not just at people who are interested in the study of history as lay people, but policymakers and academic historians, especially policymakers. The ethic that went into the commissioning of this book was really that in the midst of a crisis, we can still write cogent, interesting stuff about what's going on, and that can help people who are engaged grappling at the kind of coalface. That was really part of the commissioning process, and it's a real article of faith.
And as you say, when you read this book, you also realize that a qualitative difference between our times and a lot of times before us is, of course, that now we have much more historical research and it's much more accessible. So in theory, we could be much more well-informed now, but reality is something different. How do you see that? Of course, we could all sit and Google and get very interesting sort of historical information to give us perspective, but do we actually take the time to do that?
Yeah, just because we've got more facts available doesn't necessarily mean we have a better sense of historical perspective, which is kind of a paradox. Logically, you'd expect the reverse to be true. The more we know, the more information we know, surely the more we would know about the past. And unfortunately, history kind of eludes that kind of logic. It's just a bit too mysterious, I think. And actually, historical perspective is an elusive thing. It's not something that you can get through just endless, immersing yourself in the kind of facts of the matter. History takes in story, narrative, myth sometimes. It's practice which takes us back into the past, but it is only one method among many that takes us back into the past. And I think the best history is really sensitive to that. But yeah, I'm kind of saying like good historians know when to shut up, basically.
And it's sort of a form of curation almost, isn't it? Also in how you have to curate the sort of historical research that you can take in.
Yeah.
Another thing you realize when you read this book is that after all, we're human, meaning sometimes we are swept away by emotion and being overcome by certain events and certain pains. Other times we are able to stand very still and reflective, even though there's a disaster around us. When it comes to looking into historical research, is there a risk of overinterpreting or sort of making too much of similarities between historical events and our own time?
Yeah, and again, that really illuminates this idea that I have that history is a powerful tool. We can tell it's such a powerful tool because when it's badly applied, it leads to really bad consequences. Take Vladimir Putin, for example, a world-leading amateur historian, in effect, who wrote an infamous essay on the history of Ukraine and Russia a couple of summers ago, which effectively recapitulates the historiography of Imperial Russia and Soviet-era ideas, to make an appeal to modern Ukrainians, to frame the interests of contemporary Ukraine on Russian terms, on Putin's terms, and who has suffered as a result of this worldview, albeit historically informed, or should I say misinformed. It's the Ukrainian people who he claims to address as a brotherly people in his essay for what he sees are very good historical reasons. So that's the kind of bad history. There's also the Putin's idea of crisis is really bad. He's obsessed with this idea that he has this very sharp perception that Russia is in a crisis without parallel, which justifies an extreme response. The threat from encroachment is ever worsening. The threat from the other great powers, it's never been greater. So this justifies very extreme actions for him. So even if we are not interested in thinking about the relationship between crisis and history and the relationship between the past and the present, other people are, and are constantly drawing parallels between what happened and what's happening now, are constantly making bad assumptions about what the past tells us. So it's imperative, as a result, that we come up with better, more truthful answers to those questions and to the questions of our time. Otherwise, other people will write the scripts and we might not like the story. And stories within history, these words do connect.
So in other words, even if you don't use history, someone else will. For their ends, right?
Exactly. And we've just got to be very aware of that. And historical judgments, again, this kind of careful parsing of what is old from what is new, this modifying assumptions in light of new facts, this kind of process that I think we should all be engaged in. I think in the end, that leads you to develop better answers and actually leads you to act in a better way in the world. And that to me is like a good use of history. But yeah, exactly. The over-relying on analogy to explain the present, I think, again, it doesn't admit the limits of where history ends. And, history can get you so far, but sometimes things are genuinely new and you need to modify your assumptions. And actually, the present can often change your assumptions about the past too. It can illuminate things about history that we maybe didn't quite know before. And that kind of dialogue between the past and the present shows that, it's not just the past telling us what to do. It's our own experience leading us back and always leading us back into what people have done before, the things and people that history has known, like the whole magnificent wealth of experience there. I think it was the historian Neil Ferguson who once said, and I'm paraphrasing, that you should study history because you've got the collected wisdom of not just billions of people, but billions and billions of people, all the people that have ever lived, all their minds, all their peculiar sympathies, all their writing is available to you. So you might as well use it because you might learn something.
Yes.
But you might not always learn the right things. And again, you might not always act in the right way, but it's a process. It's something that may or may not yield results over time. Just reading one book about something obviously will lead you to a partial view, but if you are invested in a process that could even last as long as a lifetime, that to me is very valuable.
Could we go so far as to say that a big major crisis and catastrophes are actually good for history because we are reminded of the importance of it?
Yeah, exactly. I think they provide a quite useful vocabulary. It's a kind of hook, as it were. And I think the kind of example I'd like to use to show why it's important to have hooks that we might not all agree about is really kind of, if you go back to ancient Rome and Greece, these kind of great traditions, it's important to me to study those cultures, those ancient cultures which are quite removed from our own in lots of ways, because all of the writers that and their work that have come down to us in all that wealth of information, all of these writers have made arguments that we have made about our own time, roughly speaking, and they've all made the counter-arguments too. So there's not an argument, for example, for imperial expansion that you can find among Roman writers that is not challenged by another writer who's a Roman, or indeed by the same writer in another piece of his work. So crisis is no different. I think we have to keep on talking about crisis, picking which crises we think are the most important to us. So you could, in the history of the 19th century, say, no, 1848, that's the year that everything changes. Or you could say, no, 1830, that was actually more significant. Or in the 20th century, we all know the key dates, where pick your champion, as it were. But that's all part of the kind of process, listening to the counter-arguments, and then you modify your assumptions. And it comes back to that idea that once we start thinking about crisis, which we often think about as a kind of break in history, we can also think about the reverse. We can also look at the continuities because it's a way into it. And actually, also the reverse is true as well. I'd like to speak to someone who says that crisis, we overdo crisis. We've always been in crisis, so what does it really mean? And that helps us to think about where the pinch points really were, about the structure of the whole thing and the structure of history. These things may or may not be, again, lead us to act better in the present. But it feels like that process, when it's carried out at length, when it's carried out with the best teachers available, and I hope in the volume Society in Crisis we found some of those great teachers, we do think that makes a difference.
So what you're saying really is that even though history cannot be used as a step-by-step toolbook per se, it does offer you a much richer reference spectrum and more knowledge and more care about the decisions you take. It's sort of heightened awareness, again, that is at the bottom of it all, even though there are not always easy answers.
Yeah, and awareness is a great word. It's at the heart of everything, isn't it? And we know it in life. We know that being more aware, more conscious, as it were, not overly self-conscious, but just conscious about where you are, about who you are. We all know that eventually leads you to act better. I think history is also about the missteps you make. It's also about the mistakes. And a lot of history is about people making mistakes, but a lot of the study of history is about people making mistakes and changing their minds. And you can make mistakes for bad reasons, but you can make mistakes for the right reasons, which is that you're exploring. And you're not always going to come up with the right answers immediately. Everyone knows that when they start studying history at school, that it's an adventure. It should be fun. And there should be a bit of leeway, that kind of indulgence in people who are trying to modify their assumptions in the face of new information and sometimes failing. And I think sometimes mistakes can be as interesting as the things we get right. Why did we think that? Were we led to think in that way? Why did he make a mistake? We can endlessly discuss these things. But again, I think we intuitively know just that watching films or reading novels or whatever just helps us navigate the everyday. But with history, it feels like a little bit more removed, and it feels a little bit like we need to make a bit more effort to get there. And, that may be a problem with history, that it's not accessible, that it's become too theory-based, that it's become too rooted in its own kind of vocabulary that is a bit inaccessible. We really disagree. History doesn't need to be like that. History can be accessible. The ideas can be sophisticated, but if you had good writers who can communicate well, there's no reason why someone who's picking up this book for the first time can't access it and can't get something out of it. And again, I think my own reading, I read something and I think, well, I didn't really get a huge amount out of that. And then 2 days later, something pops into my head and suddenly you think, no, that did give me a kind of just a slight varnished something. It gave it a little bit of emphasis that I probably hadn't thought before. It may be a purely internal process, but that, again, intuitively, that feels really valuable.
The point is really then to open up, and when the realization happened, that's another matter, but as long as you're open to it, that's the major benefit.
Exactly, and I think historians can rise to that challenge, and I think with this volume, we asked historians to rise to the challenge of events, which did seem like they were unparalleled, did seem like that we were in this extraordinary situation. And it did feel like it was very hard to get a handle on what was going on. But I hope that when people read this volume, they'll feel that there were people thinking very deeply in a very informed way about what was happening. And I do really think that a lot of the kind of big calls in that book by these academics about the kind of what was going on have been borne out by the kind of broader structure of the time, which I think the pandemic is Sweden may have a different experience. I know that many of the responses, the national responses to COVID were, of course, were similar to lockdowns, but there were many modifications that various countries made to that picture, Sweden being a notable example. But I do think now, looking back over the whole thing, and I'm speaking from the UK, which had its own experience, we are beginning to have a bit of a kind of broader reckoning about what it meant. And saying that, I think we are also missing some of the key lessons about what happened. I think many of the problems, for example, in British society, and I don't want to go too much into the kind of domestic situation here, a lot of the problems that we face at the moment, which we often seem to blame on policymakers, on politicians making mistakes, or on things which are in the gifts of politicians right now, I think are actually in the shadow of the pandemic and are products of the kind of multiplying social pathologies that the pandemic exacerbated. Arguments about the value of education, about what the value of work is, about how our economy is structured. Many of us seem to be now having this conversation without really admitting that there was a big thing that happened 3 years ago that really changed a lot of people's assumptions about these problems. And it's not just business as usual. At the moment, we are living in the shadow of the pandemic. Spanish flu was actually pretty similar, even though it kind of disappeared from public explanations of what was going on.
Yes, let's get into that. Because one interesting thing you learn from this book is, of course, that there is not a, let's say, mathematical relationship between how big the crisis is and how well known it is afterwards. And it's been generally noted that the Spanish flu, in 1918, 1919, 1920-ish, I mean, we know a lot about the Black Death and the plague and the medieval sort of gruesomeness, but the Spanish flu, for some reason, we have very little cultural representation of, and we just don't know it, even though it happened much closer to our own time. What is going on?
I'm just thinking about Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which is all about plague. There isn't a film about the Spanish flu that's quite as popular. I think the Black Death was, I guess, bigger because of just the mortality. But you're right, Spanish flu, but it is there. And I think there was a fantastic essay in this volume by the historian Sir Hugh Strawn, who's an immensely distinguished authority on the First World War, among other things. He wrote a wonderful piece on just this question, and Strawn argues that the reason that the Spanish flu doesn't seem to be the kind of definitive story of 1918 to 1920, and indeed, I like every British school pupil who learns about this era, Spanish flu really doesn't get mentioned. And Strawn argues, this is the argument, that death was kind of so ever-present at the end of the war, that the flu just seemed to be part of the terrible atmosphere of the time. It
blended in.
Yeah, just sort of more death among other deaths. And to me, when I read this essay, and I remember editing it, and when you sent it over, I remember reading it for the first time and just thought, this is the stuff I want to be involved in and publishing in journalism. This is why I wanted to be a journalist, is publishing exactly this sort of thing. It's like a really informed perspective that kind of changes your view, that gives you something new to think about. And it made me think about, for example, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which is a novel which has lots of memorables. It's sort of famous for its scenes of shell-shocked people who are failing to adjust to normal life. There's a very famous, the middle section is all about this character who's clearly suffering from a kind of illness as a result of the war. But it's also clear in the novel that Mrs. Dalloway herself is weakened by illness, which is the Spanish flu, and she's still in a kind of recovery, and she's treated kind of differently by people around her, I think, as a result. So it's definitely there, and it sort of, a lot of culture of the 20s lurks in the shadow of the Spanish flu. And I think something similar has happened a little bit with COVID at the moment.
Yes. Is there a risk it will happen the same thing? The COVID wasn't, spectacular enough to make it among famous historical catastrophes.
Well, yeah, I wonder. And I think it kind of comes back to what I was saying. I think we're getting that wrong a bit because a lot of the problems we now see in Western societies are 100% massively exacerbated by not just the pandemic but our pandemic responses. I think in Britain anyway, I can speak confidently that the Second World War was invoked very often as a kind of guide to dealing with the pandemic. And I remember feeling quite suspicious about this idea because I think war is quite a bad way of thinking about a disease. They're not quite the same things. So you can say we're going to declare war on the virus, and many Western politicians said exactly that. And the problem with that kind of reasoning is that people who can't isolate from the disease then get seen as a bit of a fifth column. You're acting for the enemy. The disease is the enemy. And in complex societies like our own, there are many people who could not completely isolate, who worked in jobs which, for example, in the service industry, which meant that they just couldn't. And I felt that there was a lot of judgment about those kinds of people that was potentially influenced by this idea that we had that it's like a war. And the biggest war in just about living memory for the UK is the Second World War, even though none of the conflict impacted on the mainland. And perhaps, that's another interesting avenue for reflection.
For sure. Is it a fact then that for a crisis, a historical crisis, for it to survive in our historical consciousness, it needs, first of all, no competition from another maybe bigger crisis, so it sort of comes in the shadow. And second of all, it needs maybe almost cinematic quality or something you can touch on, something that is easily on a dramaturgical scale. Is that really what it takes for a crisis to be truly remembered?
Yeah. I mean, I think people intuitively know that. They know that great stories about the past can make us act differently in the present, which shows that the facts of the matter in history are important, but sometimes how we interpret those facts is equally as important, which is about, as you say, the story, the cinematic quality, the story also that policymakers paint at the time. And I think during the pandemic, that was something that was really interesting. I think policymakers were trying to use history by analogy and to paint stories about what was going on, especially when we were in lockdown. I think that was a really vivid time for people to try and explain what was happening. And much of that kind of story making is a legacy we will live with for a long time. And we may find that when we experience disease, a global pandemic in the next 100 years, God forbid we do, but we may find that we're recapitulating some of those stories without really knowing it. And I think to work out when policymakers are just singing an old song rather than rising to the challenge of the present, history gets us that perspective. History makes us able to work out what's happening.
Yes, and that brings us to a very important question of course, who should read this book? Because obviously this is written in a way that I think sort of everyone is able to read the book. But when you take this perspective of broad outlook on history, understanding that all crises are interconnected, they're always more complex than we talk about them afterwards and so on, who do you think is the most important reader of this book?
I'd say the most important reader is the layperson, the person who is interested in history, actually who might be a bit skeptical about applying history to the present. And number two, I genuinely think policymakers would be good for people involved in public life in particular to read history that is an attempt to think about the present.
Right. So policymakers and people in power, basically.
People in power, because we all know at the moment the politicians, I think politicians know this as well, that at the moment they feel buffeted by events, that they're lurching from crisis to crisis to crisis, and that each crisis almost feels worse than the last. The last 10 years, it's felt like political crisis has just been the order of the day. But I think part of the reason politicians do feel buffeted by events is because it's very easy to lose historical perspective, especially in the way in which contemporary politics is set up and the particular pressures that politicians face. Our leaders 50, 60, 70 years ago did not necessarily make the right decisions and made lots and lots of mistakes. But I think with confidence you can say that policymakers in the kind of pre-internet age, in that era, were certainly more historically literate than politicians of our time. And I think the great power of democratic societies is that they can self-correct. It's the great faith that we all have in the democratic process, that we all know societies make mistakes and politicians make mistakes, but we believe that through a democratic process, we can change our minds. We can change course. We believe that autocratic societies, authoritarian societies, cannot go through that same process. Authoritarian societies and policymakers at the top of authoritarian societies may get things right. Of course, they might do well for a period, but we believe in democracies that the problem for authoritarian societies is they can't self-correct, and that the mistakes they make are much more fatal to them and much more fatal to their prospects in the long run because they don't have that internal mechanism. And I think on a super pragmatic level, that's what we believe democracy does. It's not a romantic view of democracy, but it is, I think, a view that helps us view politics in its proper place and helps us see what politics can do for us. And I think we are at great danger in Western societies of losing a major buttress for that kind of self-correction, which is the practice and public conversation around the past and around history that is informed by great minds and informed by the greatest authorities of the past, which is a really helpful guide to that process of making mistakes, of seeing what went wrong, and of making sure that it doesn't happen again. And I think, yes, for democratic societies, the practice of history, it's absolutely fundamental. And without it, I think we may lose that capacity, which has always marked out democracies from countries which don't have the same kinds of self-corrections. And that, to me, is a really dangerous and perilous path to be serious about it.
Now, a last thing we have to talk about, of course, is the fact that when the book was written, the war in Ukraine had not yet started. But of course, had it been published maybe just a year later, that would change things too. But in general, I mean, you have a background in war studies. Facing this war and facing the shocks, the multiple crises arising from it, the constant flow of information about the war, different parts of war, the information war and so on, how has that reshaped our understanding of using history and the history of crisis to learn from?
Well, I've talked a bit about Vladimir Putin's own perceptions, as far as we can tell, of crisis and historical destiny, and how that played out in those first months of 2022 in the build-up to war. Although I think there is some evidence that he decided to go to war as early as late summer 2021. He'd actually made up his mind a long, long time ago, partly through his reading of history. And I think that's a really interesting question, because it kind of gets to the heart of the matter. You know, the war in Ukraine, which is the largest major power conflict since the Second World War, certainly in Europe, has brought all these questions to the fore. How do we understand the structure of human conflict? How do we get a handle on it? Something that seems so vast. We could use, on the one hand, something like epic poetry, something like the Iliad, one of Europe's oldest cultural artifacts, which is all about war. It's all about understanding how the rage of warriors like Achilles intersects with the destinies woven by the gods, by what we would call fates. I'm also a classicist, as well as having studied war. And I think in reading those kinds of texts, that kind of literature, that certainly illuminates certain situations on the battlefield. But we're probably in an age where we don't really believe that war is like an instrument of divine will, and that warriors are trying to kind of like respond to that. And epic poetry probably gets less for hearing. But it's really history we have to turn to if we're to promote a kind of deeper and broader understanding of contemporary events. War is dynamic, it has its own momentum, it has its own curious dimensions, and you can't illuminate that through like an overly rationalized scientific understanding of history. History done well allows for the complexity of the human subject, and particularly the human subject when it's under extreme duress and operating in extreme circumstances. War is probably one of these extreme circumstances. And when we talk about war, we are really talking about a human activity, and that's where history comes into play. You know, even drones need pilots at the end of the day. So history, I think, addresses itself very directly, first and foremost, to what human beings want and what human beings do. And there are, of course, many avenues available to us to understand conflict in the present. Literature's obviously a great guide in some ways to the experience of war. Some of our greatest literature in all cultures is about war and conflict. But because history, I think, is really about human beings, ultimately human beings operating within context, situations and structures and what they do. And war, I think, is that a really fundamentally human activity. I think history is a great, great guide. You can zoom in to this conflict. You can think about the deep national history of Ukraine, for example, or you can think about the sanctions arrangements that Western democracies have imposed on Russia in light of the way in which US and British policymakers thought about sanctions 100 years ago. Economic sanctions, blockades, these are all the stuff of history. And you can debate about why great powers go to war and why they often behave in ways that seem really irrational. There are myriad avenues that history offers to us. And I think in having these debates, it may be a bit of an indulgence, but in having the debates about what is going on, especially debates that are well-informed, that know their limits, that know where to stop, that know where sometimes history doesn't describe what's really going on in the present, I think you can develop a better and more comprehensive sense of what is going on. Major war of the kind that Ukraine certainly is, a kind of major war, may be our reality again in the next 100 years. It is the reality for Ukraine as we speak. We may not be so lucky in our own countries and around the world, and we should be prepared. Places like the Indo-Pacific, there is a looming threat of a great conflict there. We should be prepared to think about these problems. And history, although history is just one avenue to understand what's going on, I think it is a good one.
It's an essential one. And one thing is for certain, that is crisis will continue. Whether we'll learn from them or not, that remains to be seen. Alastair Benn, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Tack för att du har lyssnat på Stolpe Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på Bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos Bokus.se. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden Stolpe20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.